Questions oftentimes you hear from people who have no experience or little experience with this type of violence in their lives might say, well, why didn't they just get away? Why didn't they just call the police? Why didn't they just leave him? Why stay involved in that? Why allow that to happen to yourselves? And those questions are really not that clear cut when you understand how this kind of violence, this cycle of violence works. Known notoriously as the Black Swan Murder, a Florida ballerina shoots her estranged husband in what prosecutors allege was a calculated and cold-blooded murder. Her defense maintained she was a battered woman pushed to the brink by an obsessive and abusive ex-partner. Plus, in another case with striking similarities, a U.S. Customs officer has been found not guilty by a Florida jury for fatally shooting her husband, with allegations of systematic violence once again playing a key role. All this and much more this week on Courtroom Confidential. If there was a running theme to the cases this week, it would be women who kill. And these cases, I think, are unique in the questions that they ask about our expectations about how the world works. We stop in our tracks and we take notice when we hear that a woman has been accused of murder, or that a woman has been accused of murdering a man in particular. And I'm not going to get into all the reasons as to why that is psychologically as a society that we think about these cases differently, but we do. It's a fact. And I think that's why in these cases, motive plays a much more important role. We want to know why. Why would a woman go about committing a crime of violence like this? Why would a woman go about killing her partner, taking the life of her partner? It's interesting. It's fascinating from a psychological perspective. And these cases also present really interesting legal questions that we'll get into. So let's jump right in. First, opening statements in the murder trial of a Florida ballerina kicked off on Tuesday, giving a preview of how attorneys will present their sides in the case being dubbed the Black Swan Murder. Ashley Benefield admitted to fatally shooting her husband, Navy veteran Douglas Benefield, in a Lakewood Ranch, Florida home in September of 2020. Prosecutors argued that Ashley Benefield wanted to get her husband out of her and her daughter's life, and she would stop at nothing to achieve that goal. This is a case about a woman who, early on in her pregnancy, decided she wanted to be a single mother, prosecutor Suzanne O'Donnell said. She did not want the father of this child to have any visitation, concluding, at the end, when there was no other option, she shoots him and she kills him and claims self-defense. The defense countered that Doug Benefield was abusive and intimidating. I want you to note how he's built for a 58-year-old man, defense attorney Neil Taylor said. I'm going to have some strong words about Douglas Benefield, the alleged victim in this case. I say alleged victim because he was anything but that. The evidence is going to show that Douglas Benefield was a very disturbed man. Taylor went on to argue that Doug Benefield was obsessed with his wife and insisted on control. He fired a handgun into the ceiling of their kitchen on an occasion to stop Ashley from talking, Taylor said. He threw a loaded gun at Ashley. He punched their dog in the face so hard he knocked the dog unconscious. Ashley Benefield feared him, Taylor said. She feared for herself and for her unborn child. 3 years before the shooting, she left him. He pursued. She rejected him. He would not take no for an answer. She at times despised him. He did not care. She moved to get away from him. He followed her. Trial is expected to last through this week, with closing arguments expected today or early next week. All right, what's happening here? This case and another case we're going to talk about today highlight a theory that we've talked about a couple of times before on this channel, and that is the idea of battered spouse syndrome. And I will say, first of all, that defending cases with this type of a strategy can be very difficult because battered spouse syndrome is essentially like a cousin of self-defense. It's self-defense without the immediacy. The elements of self-defense are that, first, that the defendant reasonably believed that she was in imminent danger of being killed. Imminent. that's going to become important to our discussion here. Second, that the defendant reasonably believed that the immediate use of deadly force was necessary to defend her against that danger. Again, immediate. And lastly, that the defendant used no more force than was reasonably necessary to defend against that danger. You see these themes coming up again of reasonableness and immediacy. And battered spouse syndrome, battered wife syndrome, whatever you want to call it, battered domestic partner. It essentially says that because of systematic abuse, because of this cycle of violence, that immediacy is always present, that they're always under that threat and danger of losing their life. And so therefore, the same requirements that we might see in a direct and more straightforward self-defense case where, questions like, was the person, the victim, also holding the weapon? Was the victim the aggressor in the fight? Those questions don't become necessarily as important because the argument, the theory behind it is that the defendant had always been in fear, was always feeling like they were on the edge of being attacked and that their life was always on the edge of being in danger. And so therefore, whenever they acted, essentially, they were acting in that same immediacy. Now, it is not the same as self-defense in that it is a total defense, but it can be a mitigating defense and helping the jury to understand the mindset, the motive behind why a person did what they did, and in this case, Ashley Benefield. And I said from the beginning, I think these are very difficult cases to prove because a lot of it's going to depend on jury selection. Are there people on that jury who understand domestic violence? Were they perhaps victims of it themselves? Do they have family members who are victims of it? Do they understand how it can become a ever-present, insidious sort of a danger and fear for a person? And that they may not behave in the ways that people who don't have experience that might expect them to behave. In other words, questions oftentimes you hear from people who have no experience or little experience with this type of violence in their lives might say, well, why didn't they just get away? Why didn't they just call the police? Why didn't they just leave him? Why stay involved in that? Why allow that to happen to yourselves? And those questions are really not that clear cut when you understand how this kind of violence, this cycle of violence works. And so it's important, and many times I feel like these cases are really won or lost with jury selection. It's important that to the defense that there are people on that jury who understand it, because otherwise you're going to be left with a question are you telling me you want me as a juror to let this person walk when this man was not armed? This man, there's no evidence he was presenting any kind of threat to her at that time. She shot him and took his life, and now we're supposed to believe that because they were having a bad relationship, that he had been violent to her in the past, that he had even been threatening to her in the past, that she all of a sudden gets a get out of jail free card to go ahead and take this man's life. That's how difficult an argument it is to make. But what do you guys think? You guys are the 13th juror. I know you've been following this case closely. Which side do you find to be most convincing so far? Please let us know in the comments. A U.S. Customs officer has been found not guilty of first-degree murder in the shooting death of her husband. Marcia Thompson was charged in the August 2019 death of Terry Thompson at their Florida home. A responding officer noted 6 bullet wounds on Terry's body and 9 fired shell casings in the living room. The couple's 2 children were home at the time, but did not witness the shooting. Marcia's defense argued that she acted in self-defense and was suffering from both battered spouse syndrome and post-traumatic stress. Marcia took the stand in her own defense, recalling how the couple's once affectionate relationship had turned into a nightmarish cycle of abuse. Affection soon turned to jealousy, and Terry began insisting that his wife keep her phone on her at all times of the day. Missed calls and unanswered texts incensed him, ever paranoid that his wife was seeing someone else. Marcia Thompson said he controlled what she wore, where she worked, who she saw. He reminded her often that she wasn't a good enough mother, a hard enough worker, a pretty enough wife. Her hair was wrong, and so were her clothes. Marcia described one incident where in a fit of rage, Terry pushed, punched, and choked her before sexually assaulting her with a lotion bottle. During another incident, she described being dragged down the street by her hair while she held their baby in her arms, prompting passersby to call police. The jury acquitted Marcia Thompson of first-degree murder Monday after deliberating for an afternoon. All right, again, what is happening here? Again, we see this concept of battered spouse syndrome. And here, I think something that makes it a little bit different is the way that there actually is a history that was able to be presented to the court. There were prior phone calls. There were other witnesses who saw firsthand this violence. One witness described the condition, physical injuries she suffered at the hands of this man. That is powerful stuff. That is not just a defense attorney making an argument that this was a home that included violence. That is something that jurors can see and witness and hear for themselves. And one other thing is she testified herself. And I think that might be the turning point in many of these cases, is if you're going to make the claim that you were suffering from abuse and you were suffering from violence, and that was so pervasive and systematic that you felt like you had no option but to take another person's life, the jurors are going to want to hear from you. It's almost like you owe it to them to hear that out of your own mouth and take the stand and tell them exactly what happened. And in this case, it was incredibly powerful. And in this case, it carried the day, I think, for jurors to actually hear the kind of abuse that she had suffered. Now, that all being said, from a strictly self-defense perspective, I have problems with this case. I'll be honest with you about that. Because of the elements that we talked about before with self-defense, it involves a reasonableness factor. Battered spouse or battered partner syndrome is not what we call a complete defense. It's a mitigating defense. It may help jurors understand why this isn't murder, but perhaps a manslaughter type charge. Self-defense is different in that it is a complete defense. It is categorized as justified homicide. If you convince jurors of self-defense, you walk, which is what happened in this case. And that's why I take a little bit of issue about the circumstances surrounding the actual claims of self-defense. Not that she was a battered woman, not that she was suffering incredible violence at this man's hands, but that actually satisfied the elements of self-defense to give her a complete defense. And I guess the best way of saying this is that those concepts are not mutually exclusive. You can both be a victim of horrible domestic violence and still commit murder. And I think that may have happened here. Now, the jurors felt differently, and I will respect that. But here's why I take a little bit of issue with it, is the idea of reasonableness. In this case, there was no evidence that he was armed at the time. In fact, there was evidence that he may have been seated at the time that he was shot. He was shot 6 times with no weapon from a seated position. How that can rise to the level of a reasonable response to whatever he may have been saying at that time was to take his life, to fire 6 shots into him. How that can demonstrate immediacy for the point of satisfying those elements at that point, no matter what was coming out of that man's mouth. That gives me pause, and I'm sure you can understand why. Now, do you think that the jurors simply heard everything, the nightmare that this woman had been living through, and understood the position she was in at that moment, and that she did fear for her life, reasonable or unreasonable? She feared for her life at that moment and decided the only thing that she could do was to fire that weapon off 9 times, hitting him 6 times. They obviously did. And it makes me wonder, is the fact that he was such an unlikable person as he was presented to the jury, Did that play a role in their decision making? Should that have played a role in their decision making? I mean, the strict answer on that is that's not an element of this. Likeable or not, we don't kill people. But do you think that the jurors felt like they could sleep a little bit easier and perhaps find a little more wiggle room in the law for this woman when realizing and having really solid evidence to corroborate the abuse that she was suffering at home? Again, this whole subject matter is horrible, and domestic violence is a plague across this country. But I'm trying to, get into the weeds on these cases from a very legal perspective, and I hope that you all appreciate that. But as always, I would much rather hear what you all think more than I think. Do you guys feel that the jury got it right here? Am I getting too into the details on the law of self-defense, and am I missing the big picture? I'm too concentrated on the trees to see the forest. Please let me know in the comments. All right, before we dive into other cases making headlines this week, I only ask this one very small favor of you all. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps us immensely in being able to provide you with more and more content. If you have already subscribed, thank you so much. Now call up a friend and have them subscribe. We are completely blown away by the response of this growing Courtroom Confidential community, and we are so thankful. Thank you so much. And don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential as a podcast. Please join our community on all major podcast platforms. All right, also making headlines this week, family matriarch Donna Adelson appeared in a Tallahassee court Monday afternoon via Zoom from her jail cell ahead of her September 17th trial. Adelson is accused of conspiracy and murder in the shooting of her former son-in-law, Dan Markell. The FSU law professor was gunned down in his driveway 10 years ago last week, July 18th, 2014. 4 people have already been convicted and sent to prison in the murder-for-hire plot, including Adelson's son, Charlie Adelson. Donna Adelson was arrested last November at the Miami airport as she and her husband were boarding a one-way flight to Vietnam. In one bizarre maneuver, defense attorneys told the judge that they intended to file a request to move the trial to a different courtroom. Defense attorney Daniel Brashbaum did not elaborate on why they're planning to request the change. Both sides told the judge they will be ready to begin jury selection on September 17th. Trial is expected to last 1 to 2 weeks. Noisy crowds of demonstrators gathered Monday outside the Norfolk County Superior Court in Dedham, Massachusetts, where Karen Reed returned to court for a hearing that set a schedule for motions and a second jury trial expected early next year. Reed is accused of hitting her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, with her black SUV outside of a home in Canton on January 29th of 2022. Her defense contended that O'Keefe was dragged outside after he was beaten up in the basement and bitten by a dog at a fellow Boston officer's home. Earlier this month, Judge Beverly Cannoni declared a mistrial after the jury informed her that they were hopelessly deadlocked in their deliberations. However, within days, Reed's defense filed a motion to dismiss, along with affidavits that they had heard from 2 jurors and 2 other informants who said the panel agreed Reed was not guilty of 2 of the 3 charges. The defense maintains that Reed should now be entitled to an acquittal on those charges. Judge Cannoni kept Monday's hearing brief, quickly setting a hearing on August 9th for oral arguments on the defense motion to dismiss, adding she also expected an appeal regardless of her eventual ruling. Cannoni then proposed January 14th for a pretrial conference and January 27th as a start date for a new jury trial. Sarah Boone will need to find her own defense attorney if she does not want to represent herself in her second-degree murder trial connected to the 2020 death of her boyfriend at their Winter Park, Florida apartment. And she's crafted her own employment ad to help her find just such an attorney. The hand-drawn ad was included in a 6-page letter Boone sent to the judge overseeing her case. Inmate seeks attorney, reads the ad, with inmate and attorney emphasized in bold-like writing. Looking for a prosperous challenge? Ready for your close-up on national television? Are you zealous with a side of keen? Reads the ad. Show the world who you are with your original creativity, extraordinary expertise, and confident ingenuity. In June, Judge Kranick ruled that Boone had forfeited her right to counsel through her actions after she had at least 9 lawyers take on her case, all of whom have withdrawn. Boone is accused of leaving her boyfriend, Jorge Torres Jr., to die inside of a suitcase after the pair were allegedly playing a game of hide and seek. A trial management conference is scheduled for September 29th. Trial is currently scheduled to begin on October 7th later this year. Opening statements began on Thursday for a Massachusetts woman facing murder charges in the fatal stabbing of her Boston firefighter husband. Mansfield police went to the home of Michael and Christine Ricci, not to be mistaken for the actress Christina Ricci, in January of 2021 after the couple's 16-year-old daughter called 911. Firefighters treating Michael found that he had been stabbed in the heart and on the back of his left shoulder and slashed on his back. Christine has said her husband had been suffering a manic episode for 3 days when he came in from shoveling snow. She claimed an argument ensued and that he became aggressive, grabbed her throat, and threw her to the floor. According to the prosecutor at the time of her arraignment, Christine Ricci said she grabbed a knife to scare him away. He then lunged at her, and that's when she plunged the knife into his chest. We will keep you posted on any updates as the trial progresses. Before we get into what's on the docket for next week, I wanted to take just a quick moment to thank you all for your support. The love from this growing community has been absolutely amazing, but we wanted to give a very special shout out to Chloe6732 for their wonderful review on Apple Podcasts, and to Sarah K6213 watching on YouTube from Ontario, Canada. Hello, Canada. And to Buckettree, who wants to know if memberships are coming soon. And yes, they are, so please stay tuned. Keep those comments coming, folks. We highly appreciate your feedback, and tell us where you're from. We are thrilled to hear about all of the people in our growing international community. On the docket for next week, Rex Heuermann, the man accused of killing several sex workers and dumping their bodies on a Long Island beach, will be back in court on July 30th. Heuermann, a 60-year-old Manhattan architect, has currently been charged with killing 6 women, while investigators say they are still looking at several other murders that could possibly be linked to the Gilgo Beach killer. Delphi murder suspect Richard Allen lost his latest attempt to remove Special Judge Francis Gull of the double murder case after the Indiana Supreme Court decided that doing so is not warranted. Several other pending motions on critical issues, including what evidence can and cannot be presented to the jury, are set for hearings on July 30th and August 1st in Carroll County before trial is set to begin in October. Finally, coming again this Tuesday, Courtroom Confidential is very proud to bring you another very special episode in our Case Notes series. When James Craig drove his wife Angela to the hospital in March of 2023 for complaints of severe headaches and dizziness, no one had any reason to suspect it was anything more than a passing illness. Yet when Angela's condition quickly deteriorated, doctors eventually made the decision to remove her from life support, and investigators would declare her death a heinous, complex, and calculated murder, with all signs pointing toward her husband James as the killer. Join me this Tuesday as we dive into what possibly could have motivated James Craig, an accomplished dentist from Colorado, dedicated man of faith, and loving father of 6, to become a cold-hearted murderer. Well, that is it for us this week, folks. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I will see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.